The Gateway brings you the day's news from the St. Louis region and across Missouri. It also includes stories from the Illinois side of the river and our Metro East reporter, Will Bauer.
In Alton, in Belleville, in East St. Louis, in Edwardsville, in Cahokia Heights, at Scott Air Force Base, I'm Will Bauer. St. Louis Public Radio.
Listen to reports from Will and all of our journalists weekdays on the Gateway, on the STLPR app, and wherever you get podcasts.
2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosenbaum, a reporter with St. Louis Public Radio. Joining me in studio in St. Louis is
Joe Mannies.
And our special guest, the first Southeast Missourian we've ever had on the show.
This is Todd Richardson. Glad to be your first official Southeast Missourian.
Yeah, House Majority Leader.
And not only are you the first Southeast Missourian, you are our first Poplar Bluffian as well. I don't know if that's the plural for that, but
I think Poplar Bluffian is correct, so you nailed it.
Not to do some name dropping here, although by saying that I think I am, but I actually was roommates with somebody from Poplar Bluff when I was in college, and he was friends with Greg Hansborough, who is the brother of Poplar Bluff legend Tyler Hansborough. I got to be in his car where there were all these letters from various colleges begging Tyler Hansborough to go to their various colleges. So I know Poplar Bluff pretty well, believe it or not.
Poplar Bluff very proud of the Hansborough brothers, and both very successful, and by extension, you now have, unfortunately, a lot of North Carolina fans in Poplar Bluff, but that's okay.
That's okay. We'll forgive them for that. But just tell me a little bit where your district is before we ask you kind of about how you got into politics.
Well, sure. If you left the Busch Stadium in St. Louis and you drove about 150 miles due south until you get almost to Arkansas, you'd end up right in the middle of Poplar Bluff. I represent the city of Poplar Bluff and kind of the the southern half of Butler County and the northern third of Dunklin County in the Boot Heel.
Tell me a little bit about how you got involved in politics and just your background.
Where'd you grow up?
Before you decided to run.
Yeah, I grew up in Poplar Bluff, lived in Missouri most of my life, and moved off to Tennessee to go to college. And
Where'd you go to college?
Went to college at the University of Memphis. Got my undergraduate degree and my law degree there. And then after I finished law school and my wife finished graduate school, we both decided to move back home. She's also from Poplar Bluff, and so it was one of our great desires to be able to move back home and be close to family, and so that's what we were able to do. We moved back to Poplar Bluff in about 2007, and then a few years later decided to run for the House.
Yes, you ran in a contested primary in 2010, which in Poplar Bluff is basically the election because it's a very Republican part of Southeast Missouri.
Correct.
It is, yeah. My district's a little different now than it was in 2010 with redistricting, but yeah, most of the race there was in the primary.
And spoiler alert, as I always say, you ended up winning that primary.
Yes.
And I don't think you've had a tough election since.
No, been very fortunate to not have a contested race since then, the last two election cycles, and it's been after a long, hard primary and a general in 2010. It's been kind of nice to not have to go through that campaign.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you brought to the table that was probably different from a lot of your freshman colleagues in 2011 is your father, Mark Richardson, was in the Missouri House, and he was actually in leadership at a time when the Republicans were in the minority. I'm interested of what that experience kind of taught you before you entered politics and kind of what it's teaching you now that you're in leadership yourself as the House Majority Leader.
Well, yeah, Jason, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the first thing, that it taught me, my dad served in the House for 12 years, and growing up in a family that participates in public service, it left me with, a really strong sense that good people in public office can make a difference. And, that's something I think some people find hard to believe anymore, which is unfortunate because I do believe that's still true. I believe good people in public office can have a positive impact. And so for me, growing up in that environment, very much left with the sense that public service was a noble goal and something worth pursuing. But it really has been interesting as I've had the opportunity to move into leadership, and my colleagues have put their trust in me to be the floor leader, is to, remember some of the lessons for how the House was run when the political landscape was pretty much the opposite of what it is now. And, I think it's an important reminder for me to say, all of the things that Republicans didn't like about the way Democrats ran the chamber are good lessons for us in how to use this majority. And I think if you look at our track record, both this session and in the last couple of years, we've tried to make sure that we have more civil dialogue in the House than certainly was present in some parts of the 90s. And to recognize that the minority has an important voice to bring to the table. Now, we still, with our majorities, we still have the ability to move our agenda, but that's not an excuse for, shutting out the voices that disagree with us sometimes as well.
I was just going to say, I think if any Republican who served in the 90s were told that in 2015 there would be 117 Republicans in the House, they may have fainted, basically. I know that one person who's in the legislature now, Paul Wieland, who's a senator, was in that situation.
He was.
Along with your father. And he told us on our show it actually influenced him as well. So it's definitely showcases how what could be there at a certain point in Missouri history may not be the situation forever, essentially.
Yeah, things can change pretty quickly,
They
especially
can.
with redistricting. It's who has control. I think that has some major influence, and it's just the way it is.
Yeah, redistricting's had some influence, but I think it's also been, a change in a lot of the Republican gains have happened in outstate Missouri. When my dad was elected in 1990, I think he was the maybe the second or third Republican out of the 8th Congressional District elected as a Republican. Now you look at the 8th Congressional District and there's only one Democrat left. And so that transition in rural Missouri from sort of the old moderate to conservative Democrat has been a large part of where the gains have. I remember when, and I was a teenager at the time, but Republicans' great hope was 82 and 92. That was their slogan in 1992, and the thought that we could be at 117 seats now really would have been outlandish to a lot of people who served back then.
Now, we've had House Majority Leaders on our show before, especially when now Speaker Diehl was House Majority Leader.
Sure.
But for people who haven't listened to those shows, what exactly are your duties as House Majority Leader?
Yeah, well, some people have described the role as that of a traffic cop, and there's certainly a lot of truth to that. Missouri has the 4th largest House of Representatives in the country, which means our floor activity is sometimes it's a busy place out on the House floor. And so my role as the floor leader is to decide what legislation is going to come up when it hits the calendar and in what order we're going to go to it. So that's a big responsibility, especially as we move into the kind of the meat of the legislative session as we are now with a lot of bills coming through committee and a lot of bills on the calendar.
Now, the meat of the session for our listeners is always the budget.
Right.
Because the General Assembly has to approve a budget.
It's the one constitutional responsibility we have.
And this year, because of Amendment 10 passing, in part, the General Assembly, at least many of the Republican leaders, decided to try to get it through earlier in order to, in effect, force the governor to take action before the session ends so they could make decisions on whether or not they agreed or disagreed with him on some points. And Amendment 10 does allow some undisputed override power that was disputed before. So with that as a backdrop, and with 117 Republicans, although not everybody's on the same side on stuff, the budget fight as it's gone so far on the House side, speaking in general, are there anything, how do you think it's gone? Are there any particular issue areas where you think there's going to be a battle with the Senate?
Well, I think the House budget process went fairly well. It's always a complicated process to get through 13 budget bills and to decide how you're going to divvy up $26+ billion. But I think overall, I'm very happy with the product that the House put out, and I think it represents really the House following through on what we said our priorities were going to be. We have record funding for K through 12 education once again, funding that puts us in a place where every school district in the state's going to see an increase in funding. And I'm really proud to see that we prioritized higher education this year, and particularly community colleges. For the first time, the House has taken a position. We put a little over $6 million into a line really designed specifically to go to community colleges. And we talk about economic development a lot in the state. And if you look at some of the things community colleges are doing in terms of workforce training and development, those are things that I think really the state gets a really good return on its investment there. So I think the budget overall puts the priorities where we need to be. In terms of what the fights are going to be with the Senate, I think it's a little early to tell. I don't expect there's going to be any deep chasms between the House and the Senate, but there are always differences.
Yeah, there's always differences in that process. But as Joe alluded to, Amendment 10 does kind of loom a little bit larger. You were actually the handler of Amendment 10.
Yeah.
Back, I guess, last year or the year before. How do you think that's going to affect things down the road?
Well, I think it's having the impact already that we wanted it to have, which is to bring some more certainty to our budget process and to add a layer of check and balance on gubernatorial power that wasn't there before. When we make the decisions on how we're going to prioritize spending in the appropriations bills, I think people deserve to have some layer of certainty that what the legislature appropriated, assuming revenue is where we expect it to be, is going to be spent. And frankly, that's not what we were seeing over the last several years. So Amendment 10 gives the legislature another tool in the arsenal, which is kind of how we designed it to be.
Now, has the fight pretty much resolved itself as far as the current budget, where there had been some discussions a month or 6 weeks ago, because I know the General Assembly, some of the leaders are upset over some stuff that the governor has continued to withhold, and there was some legal debate over whether or not Amendment 10 applied to the current budget or just to the budget going forward. Is that fight pretty much resolved itself?
Yeah, I think we still have disagreements with the governor about some of his current withholds, and I think we're going to continue to push for his office to release those withholds and to live up to the promise that we made to folks on how we were going to spend our state's money. But I think the question of whether Amendment 10 is going to be used on withholds that were issued prior to its passage, prior to it taking effect, I think that question is largely passed. We're looking to this budget year and looking at what we're going to do going forward, not going back.
Has the House ever passed a budget as early as it did this year? I mean, it was like for our listeners, it was just a few days ago.
Yeah, it's a faster
yesterday.
process. I believe this is the earliest the House has ever passed the budget, and I asked some folks yesterday whether that was the case, and they couldn't tell me for sure. But certainly in the last few years, this has been by far. We're about 3 weeks ahead of schedule from where we normally are.
So let's talk about a couple of big topics that are unresolved at this point. The one thing that I wanted to talk about first was a couple of labor-related issues. Now, the two things that have kind of popped up over the last few years is what is generally known as right to work, which bars closed union shops, essentially, and paycheck protection, which is another kind of moniker for a proposal.
Which would bar automatic payroll deduction of union dues.
So obviously right to work passed the House, I guess, for the first time in maybe the legislature's history, though not with a veto-proof majority. What's kind of the status of that, and what have you talked with Senate leaders about what they plan to do with that piece of legislation?
Yeah, I think we were proud to get that legislation out of the House. It was a piece of legislation that I supported and was supported by 91 other Republicans in the House, and I think it was somewhat of a historic kind of vote. We've seen over the last several years a number of states that have adopted right to work as a policy, and if you look at the states surrounding Missouri, with the exception of Illinois, most of them are right-to-work states, and so I think there's a deep concern from people that it puts Missouri at a competitive disadvantage to the states around us. In terms of what the prospects are in the Senate, to be honest with you, I don't know. I know the Senate had a hearing on their version of the Senate bill on right to work this week, and so we'll see whether that moves to the floor. I anticipate that it will, and the Senate's a different animal from the House. As some of your listeners probably know, things move at a little different pace over there. So we'll see how that debate unfolds and whether they're able to get something out.
Will the paycheck bill get through the House, or are you guys going to be doing other things first and see what happens with right to work in the Senate
Yeah,
first?
I think the right to work's in the Senate right now. I don't believe the paycheck bills have moved to the House calendar yet, and we'll spend at least this week leading up to spring break kind of working through some of the other issues on the calendar before we get to that week break, and then kind of go from there.
The photo ID bill. I mean,
Yes.
What's going to happen with that at this point?
Well, it's a bill that's passed the House every year that I've been in the General Assembly, and once again, the House has sent it over to the Senate. I think it's an open question as to whether they can get it out. We did make some changes in the bill this year. Representative Dogan offered what I thought was a very good amendment to ensure that everyone can get not only the photo ID free of charge if they don't otherwise have one, but also access to the source documents they need free of charge. And I think that really addresses one of the major, critiques of photo ID in the past is that, the state would be creating some type of barrier to getting an ID. And under the version of the House bill that we passed this year, it's just really not the case. We're going to ensure that everyone has the ability to get an ID if they can't afford one, to get one free of charge. And so I hope that helps change the conversation in the Senate, and we can move that issue forward.
Now, one issue that is kind of big here in the St. Louis region is the future of the St. Louis Rams.
Right.
And it's a situation that is ever evolving. There seems to be a new development every single day. Like, for example, this week, a downtown Los Angeles stadium basically went kaput. And there are competing stadiums there which could have an effect on this process. Now, the reason the legislature is involved in this is one of the ways to finance this new stadium on the North Riverfront, at least for now, is to, quote unquote, extend bonds which are going to pay for the Edward Jones Dome currently. And there's been kind of a debate not only in St. Louis City and St. Louis County, but also the state of whether there needs to be another vote for that to occur. There's legislation from Senator Ryan Silvey on that effect. I'd be interested to hear your take on that situation and more generally what the legislative involvement is going to be in this entire situation.
Well, obviously, it's an issue the legislature is keeping a very close eye on. And, personally speaking, as, someone who enjoys sports in St. Louis, I believe St. Louis is an NFL caliber city, and I want us to continue to have an NFL team there. But at the same time, I have, very deep concerns about publicly financing another stadium. I think are very serious questions about whether the governor can extend those bonds without voter approval. I think there are also very serious questions about whether the governor, without a vote, can obligate essentially future legislatures to in essence force us to pay those bonds going forward. So we're going to take a hard look at that. Now, I will say that no one has presented to me any kind of plan or explanation for how they would go about financing it. I know Representative Barnes had a lengthy hearing this week on kind of the economic impact, but it's an issue that I know is a concern for a great many of my members, and something we'll be paying close attention to as the session moves forward.
Is this one issue where this long-standing battle between rural and urban Missouri kind of comes into play? Because I know when we talk about stadiums, there's often a lot of rural legislators who come about and say, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for somebody in Oxvass or Poplar Bluff or Doniphan to be paying for a stadium in St. Louis. Is that kind of another concern, not only with maybe you, considering you're a more rural legislator, but just others in your caucus who hail from outstate Missouri?
I think it's probably a little bit of the issue, but I really don't think it's what's driving it. I mean, you have, you brought up the example of Senator Silvey. Senator Silvey represents an urban part of the state and has very strong concerns about it. If you look at the polling on the issue, I'm sure there would be more support in the St. Louis region for, funding a stadium. But you also see pretty strong opposition in those areas too. So I don't think it's an issue that breaks down purely on an urban-rural divide, but certainly it's an issue that a lot of my constituents have concerns about in terms of obligating the state, for another 30 years on debt payment for a stadium when we haven't even finished paying off the one we have now.
What do you think the legislative reaction would be if the governor basically extends the bonds by fiat and doesn't have the legislature involved in it?
Well, my guess is that there would be a pretty quick court challenge to that action, but I think I think that's why you're seeing so much concern out of the legislature. Is it puts the legislature in a very difficult position. It puts us in a position where we would be forced to, where the governor's essentially going to try to force us to make those payments because nobody in the state wants to damage the AAA credit rating or default on bond payments. So I think that's why, I hope the governor will include the legislature in discussions on what he plans to do and avoid that kind of situation next budget year or the one after that.
Now, another issue that has passed the Senate but has not made it to the House yet is Senator Eric Schmidt's overhaul of the state's municipal courts. This is one of the many policy proposals that came about after Ferguson unrest occurred. I'm curious, what the reaction to that legislation is in the House, because when I was talking with, for example, the associate director of the Missouri Municipal League, they expressed some confidence that they were going to be able to either make a whole lot of changes to that bill in the House or stop it completely. What's kind of your sense of where that bill is and what type of priority is it going to be for House leadership?
I think it's absolutely a top priority for House leadership. I think, clearly some of these issues brought into a little brighter light following the Ferguson, situation, but we ought to have been prioritizing this a long time ago. It's not right to have a system in our state where we've got municipalities that are basically funding the basic operations of government through traffic fines. It's not the way we should be operating government. So I'm very optimistic that the House is going to be able to move forward on that. Will there be some changes? I'm sure there will be, but I don't think that those will be the kinds of changes that will dramatically alter the purpose or the intent of the bill.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes to this, because this is essentially amending an existing law called the Max Creek Law, is one of the complaints about the Max Creek Law was they set these limits of the percentage of revenue that could be in the city's budget, but the enforcement mechanism to it was always a little bit questionable. What came out of the Senate, I think, is kind of almost enforcement on steroids. Not only does, basically if you go over that limit, you have to turn it over to schools, but if you basically ignore the call to do that, you could end up losing, for example, if you're in St. Louis County, your share of the sales tax revenue, and could even face a disincorporation election, which is a big issue in the St. Louis County area. Would you expect those type of enforcement mechanisms to be a source of contention, or do you think that that's going to be one of the things that maybe stay no matter what changes?
Well, I think, I don't know that I'd call them a point of contention, but maybe a point of discussion. I think what we want from a policy standpoint in the House is the same as what the Senate wants, and that's a system where municipalities aren't financing their basic operations through very large percentage of that revenue coming from traffic fines. So I think the House is going to look at those enforcement mechanisms. I think we'll also look at the percentages and make sure that we're allowing well-run municipalities to continue to do traffic enforcement and DUI enforcement and the things that need to happen in those municipalities, but get away from the situation where you've got in some cases 80% of a municipality's revenue coming from traffic fines. That's just not right, and I think part of the broader problem of distrust in government that we're seeing in certain parts of the state.
Now, there are other pieces of legislation or other efforts that are being made regarding related to the Ferguson unrest.
Right.
And I know that there's some dissidents that were supposed to be in the Capitol today pushing for various things. Do you think, aside from the court bill, Do you think there's any other pieces of legislation related to the Ferguson unrest that might get through the General Assembly this year?
I think it's still an open question. I think our focus in the House side and on the House Republican side particularly has been, to look at some of the more, broader questions of how you address kind of the broader problems that we see in a community like Ferguson. And I think important to keep in mind, the situation in Ferguson isn't unique to Ferguson. Some of the challenges in that community are the same we see in rural Missouri, and there's the same as you see in other parts of the state. Dealing with an area that feels very isolated economically. You deal with an area that feels very isolated in terms of quality education opportunities. You deal with an area that has distrust for law enforcement. We need to look at what the root causes of those problems are and try to address them. And I think one of the most important things the legislature is working on this year that has the potential to have a big impact in both St. Louis City and St. Louis County is this education transfer issue. It's an issue that occupied a lot of the legislature's time last year. It's an issue that's going to occupy a really huge percentage of our time this year. And the ability to get school children into better school buildings and better school districts, I think ought to be a priority for every single member of the legislature. And, I think when you look at the number of the things that could be really crowning achievements for this legislative session, I think the transfer law has the potential to be one of those.
Now, are there any key changes that you're looking at in the transfer proposal this year compared to last year, the one that got vetoed?
Yeah, obviously the one big change from last year's bill is we had a private option provision in last year's bill. It was a very limited private option provision, but that provision is gone from the bill in exchange for some reform to our charter school law and some other things. So that's the one big change, and there's some differences between the House version and the Senate version, and hopefully we'll be able to get that bill to conference committee before in the next 2 weeks and get that closer to completion.
One other issue that I don't think we talked about before the show, but one thing that I do want to ask you about is the situation with the auditor vacancy, because it really parallels a situation that occurred in Illinois earlier this year where the comptroller passed away before her term started, and the Democrats who are in control of the legislature there changed the law to prompt a special election in 2016 because, in their words, they didn't think it was fair to the voters to have somebody in that office who was basically unelected for 4 years. Now, with the passing of Tom Schweik, we have a situation where Governor Nixon is about to appoint an auditor that's going to be there, I think, for the next 3 years and 9 months, essentially. Has there been any talk in the legislature, maybe not doing it retroactively?
Because I don't think they can.
I don't think
legally.
they can, but maybe changing the law to where if there's a situation like this that occurs again, that there would be a special election in the next election as opposed to having somebody who is there for basically an entire term, essentially.
Yeah, we haven't talked about it specifically, or at least I haven't talked about it specifically in the context of what's happened over the last couple of weeks. But it's been an issue that the legislature's talked about, numerous times in the past. And I know my former colleague, now Congressman Jason Smith, had legislation on at least a couple of different occasions to do exactly that. I am certain that there will be a renewed look at how that statute operates. And I think it's an issue that intuitively will make sense to a lot of voters, and that is, they want a chance to decide who their statewide elected officials are. And when you have a tragic situation like the one we've dealt with over the last couple of weeks, having the governor be able to appoint an auditor to essentially fill an entire 4-year term is, I think, something that's probably not the right balance to strike in Missouri.
Yeah. Is there any way? But as Joe kind of mentioned, I don't think there's any way to make this retroactive.
No.
I don't believe that there is.
Well, because don't you need the vote of the public on this?
Yeah, I haven't looked specifically
constitutional amendment.
at how the vacancy gets filled is a statutory change, but I haven't looked specifically at the issue of whether it could be used retroactively. But that explanation, I think, makes sense.
Yeah, I think so too. So I think we're going to close this out here. I just want to thank Representative Richardson for being here, but I do want to make one correction to myself. we had Lieutenant Governor Kinder on the show, and he is a Southeast Missouri native, although I'm not sure if he lives there full time.
Cape Girardeau.
So
Yes.
I don't think I can make that glowing designation that I did at the beginning of the show, but I will amend it slightly by saying you are the first sitting state representative from Southeast Missouri to be on our show.
I'll take it. And still the first Poplar Bluffian, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's the most important part here. We all agree that Poplar Bluff is superior to Cape Girardeau.
Well, as
I
long
don't
as
know
we-
about that.
as
Let's not
long
get
as-
into that.
Yes, as long as we've clarified that, then I feel good about it. No disrespect to my friends in Cape.
Absolutely, and they filmed Gone Girl there, and that was a great movie.
They
so,
did.
To close this out, you can follow all of our stories at stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. You can follow Joe on Twitter at.
Jay Mannies, that's JMANNIES.
And how would we follow you on Twitter, Representative
You
Richardson?
can follow me at Rep T Richardson.
Thank you very much. And until next week, thank you for listening. So long.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.